to the members of the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Bambino, the Sultan of Sports, Babe Ruth.
I consider myself
And first we thought I was color and they were white. I mean, we could play together. I think that was my main ambition.
Mazeroski has hit a 1-0.
World swings on the 3-0 pitch.
The Dodgers are World Series champions.
The Greats of the Game looks at owners with special guest Charlie Finley. Ted Turner once said that owning a baseball team is like living out every American boy's fantasy. Well, speaking as a former American boy, I'd have to agree. Not only do you get to have fun, but you get to make a lot of money, too. Hi, I'm Tim McCarver, and welcome to the Greats of the Game. In the course of my 21 years in the major leagues, I played for 4 different owners. I started out in St. Louis with the Bushes and finished my career in Philadelphia with the Carpenters. And in between, I spent some time with the Bronfmans in Montreal and the Yankees in Boston. Now, I guess as far as these owners went, they were all pretty laid back, and maybe the direct opposite of this man, one of the most colorful characters ever to represent a professional sports franchise of any kind, Charlie Finley. Charlie, welcome.
Tim, nice to be with you, and I must say that I'm just terribly sorry you never had the pleasure of playing for Charlie Finley.
Well, so am I. Charlie, you crashed into the scene in 1960, and you were different from the other owners that represented baseball before that time. Was that by design?
Well, that's what I read in the newspapers for several years, that I was different. I'd have to say, Tim, it definitely was by design.
Were there any guys that, as far as owners were concerned, that you looked up to as you were growing up?
The first owner, Tim, that I ever met in Major League Baseball, believe it or not, was Connie Mack. At that time, I was just a youngster in 1935, and I just was amazed at the great Mr. Connie Mack.
Born Cornelius McGillicuddy in 1862, Connie Mack owned and managed the Philadelphia A's from 1901 to 1950. Nattily attired all the time, Mr. Mack, as his players often called him, won a total of 9 pennants and 5 world championships during his 50-year reign. When he finally retired at the age of 87, Mack's legacy was even remembered in a song written for him by the great George M. Cohan.
Since the great William Penn, who's the best loved of men, Connie Mack, Connie Mack.
During the Connie Mack era, there were also a lot of families that owned ball clubs. You had the Carpenters, the Griffiths, the Wrigleys, and of course Tom Yawkey up in Boston. Was this family ownership, what effect do you think it had on the game during that time? Was it good or bad?
Oh, without a question, I think it was good. The individual owners, in my opinion, was much better to read about than reading about a big corporation like CBS owning the Yankees, or the Chicago Tribune owning the Chicago Cubs. But to answer your question, I think that those individual family ownerships did an awful lot for the game of baseball.
Like Charles Comiskey, who founded the Chicago White Sox in 1900, and with his family kept control of the team until 1958. Then there were the Washington Senators, who were bought in 1920 by Clark Griffith and kept in the family even after they moved to Minnesota until 1984. Tom Yawkey, on the other hand, kept his Boston Red Sox in Fenway Park for all of the 44 years that he was the sole owner of the team until he died in 1976. While in Philadelphia, the Carpenter family held control of the Phillies for 38 years before they finally sold the team in 1981. Walter O'Malley bought the Dodgers in 1950, and his family has had control of the team ever since. But before he died in 1970, O'Malley did move his Dodgers from Brooklyn to Los Angeles.
Mr. O'Malley was a good, hard businessman. No one thought that he would take the ball club to L.A., but he did, and he also, I think, took Mr. Horace Stoneham with the Giants out there with him.
Horace Stoneham had succeeded his father as the owner of the New York Giants in 1936, and after moving west, kept the team in the family until 1976 for a total of 57 years. Well, family ownership was certainly in vogue, Charlie, for about 40 or 50 years there, and I guess the guy who broke the mold was the guy that you've been most compared with, and that was Bill Veeck.
Bill Veeck, in my book, without the slightest equivocation, was one of the greatest owners, if not the greatest owner, that baseball ever had. Bill did so much to promote the game. Bill Veeck was an individual that once you had the pleasure of knowing him, you just loved the guy. He was baseball through and through, and on top of that, not only did he have great ideas about making the game more interesting, he was a great gentleman.
Bill Veeck was probably the most unorthodox and creative baseball owner ever. Long known as the P.T. Barnum of baseball, Veeck's exploits included the planting of the ivy at Wrigley Field, as well as the use of a midget in the game, and other outrageous and innovative acts.
I think he's basically, through his years in baseball, revitalized baseball, not so much just the White Sox. You know, it's just all the innovative things he brought to baseball. He was a very creative man. He loved the game. And he wasn't afraid. He was like a Charlie Finley. I think Charlie Finley is really a protege of a Bill Veeck. You got to change things around. You got to be innovative. You got to be new. You got to be creative. It's a big business.
Perhaps Veeck understood the concept of baseball as business better than anyone else. Although he lost a leg to a World War II injury, Veeck drew on his endless energy to achieve success. He first bought the Cleveland Indians in 1946, and when he was through with baseball in 1981, he had owned 3 other teams, leaving his mark on the game wherever he went.
I think that there's only one Bill Veeck. I think he's carved out his niche in Americana. I think he will always be remembered for the things he did. I just think that anybody who's ever been touched by Bill Veeck, who's had experiences with Bill Veeck, who can remember experiences with Bill Veeck, have had a much more fulfilling and richer life.
You're watching ESPN Classic.
Kansas City, when I bought the ball club, his name was Governor Hearns. He said to me, he says, you know, I think since we're down here in Missouri, and Missouri is famous for mules, you should adopt a mule for your team mascot. And I said, okay, I will. But we called him Charlie O, and that mule lived, I think he died in about 1978. But he was a famous mule. We'd take him around to restaurants, and he'd go into all the famous hotels, you know. He'd go in the dining room, walk through them. I thought that was put a little color in the game.
I guess of all your innovations, one of your more famous innovations was the orange baseball that I just happened to have.
You really sprung that on me, Tim. Yeah, I liked that idea. As a matter of fact, for last 10 years that I was in baseball, I'd always take a dozen or 2 of these to the major league meetings and pass them out to the owners, you know, and keep telling them what a great idea this was. And someday, Tim, I think you'll see baseball adopt the orange ball.
Okay, Charlie, a bit more of a touchy issue. You did so many things for the fans in Kansas City, and that was your purported idea of coming up with all the changes and everything. And then when you went to Oakland, the same fans that you pleased in Kansas City was all of a sudden turned against you.
Well, that's true. Naturally, the fans didn't want to, in Kansas City, didn't want to see their team moved. And the only reason I moved that club, 2 reasons, I might say, because they didn't have a ballpark. They had an old minor league ballpark, and the city kept promising they were going to build one, never did anything about it. And then the last year I was there, we only received $25,000 in television revenue. And here's a brand new ballpark out there in Oakland, California. Seats 50,000. Compared to Kansas City's 33,000, brand new uniform, and a 5-year contract, television only for $1 million a year, $5 million. And naturally, see, down in Kansas City, I'm about to go broke.
With his bank account in mind, Finley moved his A's from Kansas City to Oakland in 1968 and took along with him his innovative style and all that went with it. Right from the start, the A's were an added attraction to California, especially when Finley began to personally come up with talented players like Reggie Jackson, who soon became the core of the best team in baseball. Although Charlie didn't always endear himself to the baseball establishment, his eye for talent and his team's winning records were hard to ignore.
I think that what Charlie did was, he said, I need good young talent if I'm going to be successful. I'm not afraid to pay for it. Let's go out and sign these players, because he gave outlandishly large bonuses for players, and I think back then that was a difference between a player signing with one club and another.
As a result, Finley saw his immensely talented and highly visible A's win 5 consecutive division titles and 3 consecutive world championships in the early 70s. But despite their success on the field, fan support for the A's was dwindling with each passing season. Charlie, it's amazing that the fans didn't come out and support that ball club because, I mean, 3 world championships in a row and 5 division titles in a row.
Tim, would you believe that we didn't draw 1 million fans either one of those 3 years? If I'd have had that ball club in Kansas City, I'd have done at least 2 million a year.
After that 75 season, of course, you won your last division title after winning 5 in a row and 3 world championships. And then when free agency hit, the A's started obviously going downhill because you lost all your talent.
I saw free agency coming up, okay? So I worked out a deal with Boston. Joe Rudy was going to the Yankees, to Boston for $1 million. Raleigh Fingers to Boston for $1 million. And then Vida Blue to the Yankees for $1.5 million. I could see the handwriting on the wall. And I told Bowie Kuhn was in Chicago the night that I made that deal, attending a White Sox game. And I told Bowie why I was doing that. I wanted to get that $3.5 million because I knew at the end of the year I wouldn't get anything. I wanted to use that $3.5 million to go out and sign young ball players, beat the bushes out there, and sign these young athletes because, you know, for $3.5 million back there in 1967, you could sign a lot of ball players for $3.5 million. But he wouldn't let me do it. He canceled the deal, and as a result, Tim, I wound up at the end of the year receiving nothing. I got 0 for those 3 ball players. They became free agents. I got nothing, and that was the worst thing that ever happened to me in baseball when Bowie Kuhn canceled that deal.
I was in a position to make a lot of decisions that were plainly going to stir up controversy, and did indeed stir up controversy, to veto sales of players by Finley in 1976 to the Red Sox and Yankees for $3.5 million. He took me to court. Judge Frank McCarver, in the Finley litigation, decided that, yes, indeed, the commissioner was intended to have the power to do that very kind of thing, to block trades if he thought they weren't good for baseball. And so there was really a landmark in my time as commissioner.
He really did have a lot of insight. I reflect back on trying to sell Vida Blue and Raleigh Fingers and Joe Rudy. Very sensible thing to do. When you knew players were going to leave, I would have tried to done the same thing. I mean, why not sell them for $1 million when you know that the players are going to leave? He couldn't handle free agency. He couldn't handle the possibility that players were not going to be able to be controlled by him. Baseball changed, and Charlie didn't. It's unusual. It's kind of ironic that here's a guy with all this vision and all this foresight, wasn't able to make the change, wasn't able to envision what baseball was going to. Now, maybe that's what made Charlie Finley so special, is the fact that he wouldn't change, that he did have convictions. I guess maybe some of the things that made him so successful also led to his downfall in baseball.
Whatever the reason, in 1980, Charlie Finley sold his interest in the Oakland A's, ending a 2-decade reign as one of the most colorful owners the game has ever known. Charlie, there are owners that are much like you in the game today, in baseball today. And I guess 2 that come to mind is Ted Turner, much like a maverick like yourself, and George Steinbrenner, certainly could be considered an innovator and a maverick.
Well, Tim, I don't mind you putting me in the same bag with Ted Turner, because I have great respect and admiration for that man. He's great for sports, and but Steinbrenner, I've never been a fan of George Steinbrenner.
It's important to me, it's important to all of us, and it's particularly important to New York and to the Yankees that the group that gets behind the Yankees at this point have the wherewithal and the interest and the diversity to get the kind of job done that the sports writers, that the fans, that the city and the media in New York deserve.
George Steinbrenner has never been one to mince words. Since he purchased the Yankees in 1973, his penchant for perfection and legendary temper have been well documented, especially in his dealings with Billy Martin. There's not much doubt that Billy is George's favorite manager. After all, he's hired and fired him 4 times.
Well, we straighten a lot of things out. They'll, for instance, I'll be handling all the trades.
What do you mean?
There'll be no phone calls in the dugout.
What do you mean? That's not right. I'm handling the trades.
That isn't the way we say
I have the right to call you in the dugout.
And that's not the way it's going to be, George.
Damn right it is, and if you don't like it, you're fired.
We haven't hired him yet.
Of course, George has also been known to spend a few of his hard-earned dollars every now and then. He not only revolutionized baseball by signing free agents like Reggie Jackson, pitcher Catfish Hunter, and reliever Goose Gossage to million-dollar contracts, but he's also watched his investments closely.
George Steinbrenner is there all the time. George Steinbrenner is a hands-on owner. Nothing goes on with that ball club that George Steinbrenner doesn't know about or have a hand in.
George's only problem is that George thinks it's his ball and you're going to play the game his way, and he wants to win every year. Now, the fans love him for that.
Fans seem to love Ted Turner, too, who knew little about baseball when he bought the Atlanta Braves in 1976. The team soon became one of the more popular teams in the league, and much of that had to do with Ted's maverick ideas both on and off the field. Talk about an interesting life. Not only did he skipper the winning yacht Courageous in the 1977 America's Cup, he also owns the Atlanta Hawks and his own TV network.
Ted is probably one of the most brilliant men I've ever met, and I think part of his problems may be he's so far ahead of himself and so far ahead of some of us other people that he saw things coming that we haven't seen yet, and that's why he got married his team to a superstation at Turner Broadcasting. Look what he's done buying the MGM films. I mean, this is a bold young man, and I think he's a brilliant man, and he happens to be a friend of mine, and I like him.
There are still a few small owners in the game, but most of the ownership is the clubs is by large corporations, and that's about the only thing today. Corporations that own the club.
Really, thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's been a real pleasure being with you, and I want to tell you again, anytime you want me back, give me a buzz, and I'll be here.
You got a deal. For the greats of the game, I'm Tim McCarver.
Hey, Tim, any chance of buying this show?
Cheaper than owning a ball club.
Yeah, I'm sure.